In this video, we'll take a look at how to draw an elephant with colored pencils. And how do you draw an elephant? Well, one step at a time. We'll begin by working on Bristol paper. I'm working on the vellum surface. This surface gives me enough tooth to apply multiple applications of colored pencils. We'll start with an HB pencil, just lightly sketching out the loose shapes of the elephant. Then lightly erase those graphite marks before progressing on to applying the colored pencils. I'm using Prismacolor Premier colored pencils for this demonstration, and I'll start by developing some of the darker values on the left eye. We'll start with a dark umber pencil and then layer on top of it with indigo blue, creating a natural black. We'll layer on top of these applications with 70% warm gray. For some of the lighter applications, we'll use 20% warm gray. Of course, we'll be using a variety of different grays and tones for this drawing. To add a bit of warmth in areas, we'll add a bit of putty beige. Of course, in the early stages, we're applying light applications, but gradually we want to bring the applications up to a point where the waxy binder becomes a nice medium for us to layer colors on top. So, in other words, we'll start with light applications, but as we add additional applications of the colored pencils, the material becomes more waxy on the surface and easier to move around, creating solid applications, filling in the tooth of the paper. With colored pencils, we want to create multiple applications so that our finished result looks almost like a painting. We'll continue to apply various browns with the dark umber, as well as the 20% cool gray and of course the putty beige. This is an African elephant in which we are drawing. There, of course, is another species of elephant, which is the Asian elephant. Asian elephants are a little bit more of a cooler gray, while African elephants tend to be more of a warmer gray. Because the elephant that we're doing is mostly warmer in color temperature, we'll be using the dark umber to influence some of the darker values. We'll also be using more of the warmer grays at our disposal from the Prismacolor Premier line. We'll use a colorless blender in areas to work lighter applications into the tooth of the paper. A colorless blender is basically a colored pencil without any pigment in it. So it's basically just the waxy binder, and it's great for creating burnishing effects, working the material into the tooth of the paper, resulting in that painted look that we're after. As you can probably notice, I'm making cautious marks here at the beginning, trying to fill out the colors as I go along. There's really no guarantee that the colored pencils are going to mix the way that you intend them to without some experimentation. So in the early stages of the drawing, I lay down the colors very lightly and loosely initially, and progressively work them from lighter values to darker values. As I burnish the material into the surface and become more confident with the colors that I've chosen, I can easily go back in and make some of the values a bit darker. We also want to start with light, broad applications for each section, and then get more detailed and refined with additional marks that we place over the top of the applications we've made. Here you can see I'm applying a bit of the 20% warm gray along with the putty beige, and then burnishing those applications before going back with the dark umber, and in some areas with the 70% warm gray. At this point, we're defining some of the wrinkles that happen over the top of the trunk that extends down the front of the face. I decided to start with the eyes in this case because the eyes are typically a natural focal point. With most of my drawings, I start with the focal point and work my way outward. This forces me to place more attention on the focal point. In turn, all of the other supporting elements will support the focal point as they're developed later in the drawing. We'll continue to apply these applications of the 20% warm gray, followed by the putty beige, and then the dark umber and the 70% warm gray, before burnishing those applications with the colorless blender. Even though our elephant is predominantly warm in color temperature, we'll also apply a few hints of 20% cool gray here and there just to add a bit of variety. We'll continue to darken the values on the edges of the trunk. We want to make sure that the trunk appears as though it is curved around the front of the face. This means the values on either side of the trunk will be slightly darker than the values in the center portion. Once we've got the upper portion of the trunk complete, we'll just repeat this process working our way down, initially starting with the 20% warm gray, leaving areas of lighter value in between so that we can create the illusion of form and create those wrinkles as we see them. Then again, we'll go back with the putty beige, adding a bit of warmth, and then burnishing those applications with the colorless blender, before adding additional details like the actual dark wrinkles that happen with the dark umber and the 70% warm gray. Of course, when we create these wrinkles, some of these wrinkles are going to result from horizontal marks, while some will result from some vertical marks. So we want to mix up the lines that we create. Of course, the horizontal marks are going to be more dominant. On the upper portion of the trunk, the marks that are made are spread out a little bit further apart from each other, as each wrinkle is a little bit larger. As we work our way down the trunk, of course, these marks will become more concentrated, happening closer to one another. And of course, they should curve where the trunk curves as well. Not only will these marks indicate the wrinkles, but they'll also give us a little bit of information about the form, as they serve as almost cross contour lines. Once we've got the initial applications of the lower portion of the trunk in place, we can go back and start to push some of the values a bit darker. Of course, the lower portion of the trunk where it curves will be much darker in value, so a heavier concentration of dark umber and 70% warm gray is used in these areas. If your marks are too strong, as they are in this case, we'll go back with a colorless blender and soften them up a bit. Of course, this has the added benefit of working the material into the tooth of the paper as well, creating a more solid application. Then again, with our 20% cool gray, we'll add a few marks here and there to break up the space and add a bit more variety. We can always go back and darken up some of the values at any point, but it's important to understand that if we make the values too dark too quickly, it's difficult to go back over the top with lighter values. It's amazing, however, how dark marks can layer right over the top of lighter marks, even though you've already built up a heavy application of the colored pencil material on the surface. In some areas, if we do need to make the value slightly lighter, we can go back with a white pencil, as we're doing here, to create a bit of highlight. Now, the very end of the trunk, of course, is a different color. We'll use a bit of peach initially, putting a bit of application and allowing it to fade into the darker grays, and then to make this value a bit darker, we'll apply a bit of dark umber. We'll do the same around the edges, adding a bit of detail before burnishing with a colorless blender. Then we can refine the details even further, again with the dark umber. Now again, as I mentioned before, the underside of the trunk is much darker in value, so we'll revisit it with a bit of the 70% warm gray. We can continue to add details as we see them, in this case adding a few wrinkles up on the forehead of the elephant with the dark umber. It's important not to get consumed with the details in the early stages of the drawing. As you can see here, we've started with lighter applications, burnishing them as we go, and then details are easily added over the top with a sharpened pencil. Now that we've got the head and the trunk in place, we can work our way outward, beginning with the ears. Of course, African elephants have very large ears, and they feature lots of little subtle wrinkles. So here we'll start with the 70% warm gray, creating some indications of the darker values. Then we'll switch over to the putty beige, creating some of the warmer tones that exist. And then with the 20% warm gray, we can fill in the majority of this area with a light application. We can apply a bit more pressure in areas where we're confident that the value is a little bit darker. Of course, if we allow these applications just to sit on the surface without any burnishing, you'll have the texture of the paper show through, as we can see here. But applying these initial light applications and layering them as we do, we ensure that we have some complexity in the final color. Here, with a bit more of the 70% warm gray, we'll darken up some of the values and give some indications for some of the subtle wrinkles that happen. Then with the colorless blender, we can work the material into the surface, We're basically burnishing the application here, filling in the tooth of the paper. As you can see, when the colorless blender is applied, the true nature of the pigmentation of the color shows through. We can really see the areas where we've applied the dark umber and the areas where we've applied the putty beige to produce those browns. Now, with a sharpened 70% warm gray, we can go back and finalize some of the details, including some imperfections on the ear as well. We can also darken up some of the values and a few of the subtle shadows that exist. We want to avoid outlining here and instead allow the contrast in color, although very subtle in areas, to define the edges of the ear of the elephant. Then we'll repeat this process on the other ear. Again, starting with applications of the 20% warm gray, the putty beige, and then developing some of the darker values with the 70% warm gray. Of course, we're also applying bits of the dark umber as well to ensure that some of the darker values maintain the warmth. We'll add a few imperfections here as well before burnishing this application with the colorless blender. Then we can darken up some of the values on the side of the face, this time incorporating a bit of indigo blue on top of the dark umber applications to produce darker, more natural looking blacks. And then again, with a sharpened pencil, we can go back and apply some of the details. We can continue to apply various grays if we want to apply a bit more color in these areas. Now we can work on the body of the elephant now that we've got the ears and the face and trunk in place. Again, we'll start with a light application of the 20% warm gray, followed by applications with the dark umber and a bit of the 70% warm gray, and then we'll burnish that application. Then, of course, we'll progressively add applications of the darker value, burnishing as we go. And then once we've got a base application in place, we can go back with the sharpened pencil and apply some indications of the wrinkles. Of course, you may have noticed that this process is a time-consuming process. And I think a lot of beginning artists with colored pencils, anyway, overlook the fact that colored pencils, when used properly, do take quite a bit of time to apply. Now, of course, there is the time that you have to devote to the image, but you also are getting quite a bit of control by approaching a drawing in this manner. Layering colors methodically not only gives you the ability to match the color as closely as possible, but it also allows you the ability to create quite a bit of complexity in the color as well. Now that we've got the small portion of the body that's visible in place, we can go ahead and apply a bit of the 20% warm gray to the two legs on the left side. We'll add a bit of the putty beige here as well to add a bit of warmth to the color. And then we'll start in the area of darkest shadow right underneath the trunk by applying a generous application of the dark umber, establishing all of the darker shadows. Now, the contrast is much greater in this image on the legs of the elephant. Therefore, we can go ahead and define some of the darker values right from the start, again using the dark umber initially. Then, since the value is so dark underneath the trunk on the main portion of the body, we'll apply an application of indigo blue, creating again a more natural looking dark black. Then, to eradicate any indications of the tooth of the paper showing through, we'll use the colorless blender to burnish these applications in. Here again, we can see how the colorless blender really pulls out the pigmentation of the applications, as some of the darker values become noticeably more brown. Applying the 70% warm gray over the top of these darker areas produces shadows that are much more natural. Again, we'll continually burnish these applications with the colorless blender as we go. We'll apply a bit of the 20% cool gray here and there, just again to add a bit more variety and to ensure that our color temperature does not become too warm in these areas. Then, like we've done in other areas, we can continue to push the values a bit darker. A bit of peach is added at the lower portion of the foot just to add a bit of color, and of course this ties in with the color at the end of the trunk as well. Then we can turn our attention to the rear leg, again applying a bit of dark umber here at the beginning. Again, since the contrast is so strong in this area, a liberal amount is acceptable. And again, because the value is so strong, we'll apply an application of indigo blue over the top of the dark umber applications. If your colors get too cool by the applications of the indigo blue, of course, you can layer back over the top of those applications with the dark umber. Then, of course, we'll burnish these applications with the colorless blender, allowing some of that pigmentation to show through, before adding some of the details such as the subtle wrinkles using a sharpened 70% warm gray. We can refine some of the details on the lower portion of the leg, and in this case, this includes applying a bit of the white colored pencil to accentuate some of the highlights that happen on the lower portion. After further defining some of the edges with the 70% warm gray, we can turn our attention to the remaining visible leg. And of course, we'll approach this leg the same way that we have with the others, by first applying a light application of the 20% warm gray and a bit of putty beige. Again, we can define some of the darker values with an initial application of dark umber. And since the contrast is especially strong in a couple of these areas, we'll add a bit of the indigo blue, again layering indigo blue and dark umber until we find a nice natural looking black. After adding just a touch of the 70% warm gray in areas, we'll burnish these applications using the colorless blender. After these applications have been burnished, we can continue to apply various grays and of course increase the contrast with applications of dark umber and the 70% warm gray. The overall value of this front leg, of course, is a little bit lighter than the values that we see on the rear leg and even the leg on the left side. Here again, we'll add just a touch of the 20% cool gray and a hint of light peach on the right side of the lower portion of the foot. These applications on the lower portion are burnished, and then details are added with a sharpened dark umber. We'll add a few more indications of details and some subtle wrinkles using the dark umber, and then we'll finally burnish the entire section using the colorless blender. We'll refine some of the shadows on the left side of the trunk before moving on to the final portion, which of course are the tusks. We'll start with a light application of cream, followed by a very subtle application of light peach. A bit of jade green and light cerulean blue is added. And then we'll start applying some of the darker values and some of the imperfections using the 70% warm gray. This time, we'll burnish these applications using a white colored pencil instead of the colorless blender. This creates smoother transitions between value and a more natural look. We can clean up the edges and create a subtle outline using the 70% warm gray. We'll create a hint of shadow on the lower portion of the right tusk. Now, to make our elephant appear grounded, we'll need to add a bit of cast shadow underneath. 20% cool gray is applied initially with a light application, followed by a slightly heavier application of 70% warm gray. These applications are then burnished using a colorless blender, completing our drawing of an elephant with colored pencils.